Castlevania series has always been one of my favorites. From its inception way back in the late 80s to the modern titles, there really aren't any bad ones. This time on Rank and Review, I'll be ranking all 3 titles on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and get this, reviewing them. As usual, this is just an opinion. It's sad that I still feel the need to preface these lists this way, but here we go. Number 3, oh ho ho, I know you're angry.
I know.
Castlevania 3 might be the most impressive 8-bit Nintendo game there is. The visuals, music, and scope of this thing is truly remarkable. Sure, there were plenty of impressively large adventure titles and role-playing games on the hardware, but very few were this graphically detailed. This is an expansive tour de force that demands multiple playthroughs. It's impossible to see everything in one run. Branching paths, a variety of controllable protagonists who quite literally changed the game with their wide range of abilities, they turned the explorative freedom found in Simon's Quest on its head, while axing all of the clunky bits. The individual stages are streamlined into linear chunks, similar in style to those from the original. Canonically, this is a prequel set over 200 years before the events of the other 2 NES games. We are Trevor Belmont, but you'd never know it by the way he moves. He's a reskinned Simon, and the Castlevania timeline is about as consistent or important as the Zelda one. The only difference is that Konami didn't waste countless hours of talent attempting to have it make sense in some super self-serious display of inauthenticity for a quick buck. Set in the late 1400s, Count Dracula's monsters are spreading like a disease in the land of Wallachia, and Europe as a whole. The church asks the once exiled clan of Belmonts for assistance. Kill the bosses, eat the meat, rescue a few allies. It's a video game. When this thing dropped over here in 1990, I was blown away. That's putting it lightly. Basically, I'd purchase any magazine I could get my Castlevania-obsessed hands on just to see as much of the Japanese version as I could. The hype was real. Needless to say, this was a day one purchase for me, though I guess I did just say it, so perhaps it isn't as needless as I thought. In a lot of ways, Dracula's Curse is the perfect 8-bit game. There are so many different ways to reach the end, which gave it tremendous value, as most investments at the time typically got beaten in a day or so by me. Konami made it damn sure this wasn't going to be conquered in a rental period. The difficulty, oh my god. We'll have to come back to that a bit later. Right now, I just want to keep praising this thing. From the moment I turned it on, I knew it was something special. Even today, this cinematic opening gets me in the pants. Beautiful imagery, impressive music, then a screen to enter my very own vampire killing name. Is this an RPG? Am I playing a role in this game? It's like I'm the hero. Magnificent. This brief in-game cutscene says it all. Look at that cape flip. Will capes ever be fashionable again? I'd wear one every day.
I believe he is wearing a cape.
Just look and listen to this first level. Flawless introduction as the developers ramp up the difficulty here. They toss everything the player needs to know about the game throughout this initial stage without any hand-holding or immersion breaking. Whipping objects produces power-ups and hearts. 0 enemies for this first little stretch. What are these stairs? Try them out, or wait until the natural flow forces you to ascend them in a church. The stained glass windows still impress, and the baddies are impeccably placed to teach the participant. Horizontal and vertical exploration, up and down, a beautiful variety of different backgrounds, thrashing lightning. This is an adventure. It all culminates in a graveyard with spooky ghouls and an 8-foot skelly creature. Brilliant all around. What a beginning. Pun intended. From here, the first of many forks in the road. The map in the background looks so good. It seems like an odd thing to address, but this was a huge step forward for the series back in the day, leaps and bounds above the visuals of its predecessors. By this point, I legitimately remember thinking to myself that every penny I had saved up for this game was well spent. I used to draw these screens with colored pencils when I'd reach them. That skull marker still looks so cool. Everything up to this point is probably the greatest Castlevania has ever been. I could replay this repeatedly and never grow tired of its splendor. In fact, I did so for this very review over the course of 8 different runs to capture footage. I did this despite the inclusion of a password feature, which itself is simple to memorize with its 4 characters. It's just more fun for me this way. Right, so the branching paths. How do I explain this? Basically, there are 3 optional characters who exist along any of these routes. After winning a duel with any of them, they'll offer to come along for the journey. Only one can be chosen at a time. Most of the forks in the road lead to a different protagonist. The stages are laid out in a linear way, but sometimes these paths converge, leading to areas that can be explored from different angles. For instance, this northern staircase takes Trevor to the Mad Forest if you opt to go this way straight after the first stage, but if you decide to take a detour to rescue Grant, it'll automatically skip the vertical climb to this owl region. A lot of minor changes exist throughout the majority of the adventure, with a few bigger twists after either Sypha or Alucard are encountered. These two exist along one of 2 major paths, but our little barefooted pirate goblin guy requires a detour to rescue as he's trapped in the tippy top of a clock tower. Noble thief, acrobatic wonder troll Grant Dynasty, or Dynasty depending on where you're from, a name that rolls off the tongue. I can't help but wonder if he was initially supposed to be some sort of Hunchback of Notre Dame nod, due to the whole, classic horror cinema thing Castlevania was aiming for with the original, oh I guess I'm wrong, he was a ghost this entire time. Okay then, seriously, the translation here never disappoints. Known as the most agile man in Valatia, this little guy can cling to nearly any surface, leap like a flea, and attack super quickly. Not only that, but he's the only character in the game that can be controlled in mid-air, a first for the series on the NES. He's a thrill to use, as his abilities make certain stages almost trivial. The only disadvantage is that his tiny dagger has a short attack range and is relatively weak against most foes, but in all honesty, I rarely use him for combat. It's the getting around that feels so good, especially during any of this game's many frustrating platforming sequences where the odds are definitely stacked against the player. In the Japanese version, his weapon is a projectile, making him even more of a menace against Dracula's evil minions. What's more, he can collect most of the same sub-weapons as Trevor and can use them on any surface while crawling around like an overstimulated gecko. The clock tower is the only area where backtracking is necessary, as once he is released, the player will need to descend back through in order to escape. This is a great way to naturally exhibit the transformation mechanic, as swapping to Grant makes this sequence much more digestible. The game kinda throws newcomers into the deep end here, as it ain't easy by any stretch, but checkpoints are plentiful for now, and continuing simply respawns the duo at the top. This is all rather treacherous for such an early stage, almost as challenging as the final pair in the first NES entry, but I think it was intentionally designed this way as a sort of risk-reward kinda deal. Grant makes certain late game stretches a breeze, so it's good that he's a little tough to find. He can also duck under projectiles that most others can't, making him such a handy companion. Depending on how I feel like tackling the game, he's either my first or second favorite. Sypha is the other. He's a mean, lean magic machine. Definitely a magic man. Elemental skills, fire, ice, lightning. The flames do an enormous amount of damage, able to turn almost any enemy into ash with a single use. Freezing opponents is probably the coolest effect in the game, as it can create makeshift platforms and turn some watery hazards into ice rinks. Unfortunately, the effect doesn't last long, but it does make a lot of the hairier stages more manageable, since it only takes a single staff strike to shatter a frozen baddie. His final ability casts out 3 orbs of energy that sorta inconsistently home in on enemies. It's extremely helpful against huge singular sprites on screen, but tends to be unreliable against swarms. All 3 of Sypha's abilities are found in books, and are extremely powerful when used in the proper situation. For whatever reason, the lock-on lightning seems more consistent in the Japanese version, but it's certainly no slouch here. He's also extremely quick with his melee weapon, which makes him a well-rounded powerhouse against the millions of aerial enemies in the game. Finally, we have Alucard, stiff tall, with perfect posture. He opens his cape to expose his balls of destruction. This primary attack is pretty weak. It takes him a month of Sundays to pull it off, and is about as useful as hurling wads of tape to fell a tree. You've gotta be maxed out to the tits with all 3 projectiles lined up for impact in order to do any damage, which isn't practical in the slightest, as this means you'll need to be right in an enemy's grill. He also can't can't attack on stairs, which makes logical sense I suppose due to his dramatic cape wind-up, but overall this dude really isn't of much use for me in human form. His true skill is avoidance. By gobbling up 1 heart per second, it's possible to morph into a bat, which makes a lot of the annoying late game regions a breeze. The downside is that there's no way to attack in this form, and if he's struck by anything, shifts back to his man body, which sends him falling like a useless sack of potatoes. Interestingly, a fact that no one knows about except for me is that Alucard is actually Dracula spelled backwards. Something else most of you may not know is that Super Mario Bros. 2 in North America is actually a reskin of the Famicom game named Doki Doki Panic. It's actually almost the same game, but actually Mario 2 over here had a run mechanic added to make it feel more like the original Super Mario Bros., which is actually kind of funny, because the actual sequel to Super Mario Bros. Was actually very similar to the original, only impossible. Music was added, mushrooms, that's why our North American version of Super Mario 2 actually feels like an entirely different game, because it actually is, and I'm a retro gamer foodie enthusiast who dreams of someday becoming an influencer, which is why I actually have to say these things whenever Super Mario 2 is mentioned in any video. Bow to my magnificence. I know all and will comment on all things because it makes me feel whole. Hidenori Maezawa, Jun Funahashi, Yuki Morimoto, Yoshinori Sasaki. These composers really outdid themselves here, and that's saying a lot, because the first 2 entries have some of the best tunes ever created. Oddly enough, none of the musicians involved with those first 2 titles returned for this 3rd outing, yet it's equally as good, sometimes even better. I'll gladly take this score over that from Simon's Quest. There's more of it, the pieces don't loop as quickly, and many have complex arrangements that would be suitable for a classical symphonic ensemble. Listen to this clock tower theme. There's so much going on, and it sounds even more dynamic and lush on the Famicom with its use of the VRC6 chip. Most tend to prefer the Japanese score overall, but I sit somewhere in the middle. The Western NES didn't have the ability to support external chips, so Yoshinori Sasaki had to rework the soundtrack within the restrictions of the audio hardware. Some of the tunes are a bit grittier on the limited kit to my ears, such as Beginning. I admit that there's an airier quality to the Famicom original with a fuller orchestral sound overall, but I have a soft spot for the NES alternative. It's probably the percussion. Those Konami drums are straight up awesome. Those snappy kicks are so much better than the brittle suggestions made on the Japanese machine. This will be the most subjective of all the points made in this video. It really boils down to taste, and music is always a tricky one. As good as the downsized NES tracks are, I'll always prefer the final stage theme on the Famicom, simply because it's a lot less shrill. It's still way too chaotic for me and loops quicker than a Simon's Quest tune. The VRC6 was also a lot more effective at creating subtler, creepy tones. I totally understand why people love the original Japanese soundtrack, just as I respect anyone who calls Dracula's Curse their favorite entry on the NES. Fortunately, the Castlevania collection is available on modern hardware, so it's possible to conveniently play both. It goes on sale fairly frequently too. I own all of the games, but picked it up around Halloween one year when it was like 80 to 85% off on the PS4. It's a great deal, but similarly to the Contra package, they left out a few iconic classic titles. Like, why is Haunted Castle on the arcade collection and not here? Where's Hardcore Uprising? When will we be able to legally purchase the Rebirth series on a reliable service? Konami can't help but Konami themselves, I swear. Or maybe Nintendo has the rights to the Wii exclusives. Yeah, we all know how they are with digital downloads. These are still great collections, especially at a discounted price. Plus, it now gives a larger portion of the public the ability to play what most consider to be the superior version of Dracula's Curse. Alright, so enough dancing around it. The real problem with this third NES outing is the difficulty. All of the Get Good fanboys out there can't convince me that this is a fair game. It's the biggest reason it's third on this list, but even if I were to consider the Japanese alternative, I'd still probably place it here. I'm not one to shy away from a challenge. Ancient action platformers, the Souls series, hell, Ninja Gaiden on the Xbox is my favorite video game of all time, but here's the thing, there's fair, and then there's fuck you, you know? I can beat Castlevania 3 on all paths, but there are points where it's a headache, and I stop enjoying myself. There are times where I'm convinced the powers involved watched playtesters work their way through these stages and systematically threw in a bat, a Medusa head, or another irritating enemy in the flight path just to get an easy kill. The first Ninja Gaiden on the hardware is another egregious example, but it's also a lot shorter with stages that don't go on forever. This Western version also has some very odd checkpoints that don't align with those from the original, which is probably my biggest issue. It seems artificially tinkered with as a means to prolong gameplay, but they went way too far with it. One small drop and a wretched dump of sewage is here. Okay, so a continue sends you back to the very beginning of a stage. Fair enough, that's reasonable, but here you're expected to ascend skyward atop these floating blocks, then cross horizontally over a bunch of death pits. One bad move and it's back to the bricks. The checkpoint is unreasonably far. The latter half of the stage has you ascending this treacherous auto-scrolling vertical section before three big bads in a row. Kicking the bucket here brings you back to the bottom instead of outside the boss arena. This threesome isn't particularly challenging, but by the time I get here, I'm almost out of life. Get a game over, and it's back to the falling blocks. It's exhausting. Using Alucard's bat form is fine and all, but with a limited amount of hearts, you can only go so far. Grant is another decent option, but there's always a but, because he'll need to be in jumping range of the platform to cling to it. So much waiting. Hang around for this, make a sandwich, do your laundry, grab a few groceries to stock up that fridge if you want to explore this lower area in the acid caves. Fun is a matter of opinion, but this is beyond unenjoyable for me. It's bad, and only one small example. There are plenty more. One could argue that sending the player back to the beginning of the final level is garbage. It was established in the first title that restarting outside of Dracula's chambers was the deal if one failed to destroy him. This is something I'm a bit more lenient with. It's only the third game in the series, they tried something new. I've been playing this for decades, so I can only empathize with a newcomer who thinks it's complete bullshit. I wouldn't disagree with someone who thought it was. All I can say is that the checkpoints in certain stages are completely busted, but that's only the Western version. I don't think they considered how long this adventure is when readjusting the difficulty. The first Castlevania is a tough game for many people, but it's short, and as such, relatively easy to memorize. This is a whole other kettle of fish. Akamajou Densetsu is inarguably more forgiving. Common thugs don't knock a third of your life bar off with each hit. They're still tricky, but placed deliberately in areas without a rogue Medusa head or bat tossed in to screw you over. Some don't take as many strikes to eliminate. Special items are dished out more generously. Bosses go down easier. Again, it definitely isn't a breeze and still is the toughest in the trilogy, but it doesn't play dirty. Here's a prime example. Knives are everywhere in both versions. The game wants you to have the knife. knife, the weakest, most useless of all sub-weapons. It's fine because that's part of what makes this Castlevania. You need to be aware, and it punishes you for carelessly attacking every single candle. But here in Dracula's Curse, the sub-weapon before the final 3 bosses... Ha! Yeah, seriously. Now, Akumaju Densetsu. That's reasonable. It offers you arguably the best pickup in the game. It's throwing the player a bone. The Japanese version is tough. It's like coming up against a playoff team where it's necessary to have your wits and skills perfectly tuned. The Western one requires all of that, but also somehow the fans of the opposition are allowed to throw garbage at you the entire time. One-ups are helpful, but again, the checkpoints are a mess. It would have been nicer if health replenishing brick meats were more plentiful. Many secrets are only accessible with specific characters, which is such a cool little addition. A lot of them aren't really worth your time though. Until capturing footage for this review, I don't think I ever explored this platform in the ghost ship stage, as I normally opt for a Sypha run here. I've always wondered what magical treasure was stored in, okay. Some health would have been nice, but thanks, Grant. Some levels are brief, but others go on forever. I wouldn't say they're too long, but your life bar only refills after a major event or full area has been completed, and all members of the party share the same pool. Ninja Turtles was a tough bastard, but at least you could swap out characters and start fresh while the other quietly bled out in the background. Speaking of that Konami or Ultra game, flame casting fire demons, evil. Does this mean TMNT is in the same universe? Better call Iga so he can disclaim it, the voice of all Castlevania Lord Iga. There is such an impressive variety of enemies, each of them animated extremely well. Flea men instead of these things, it doesn't matter, they're both annoying as ever. A cool little detail is that certain sub-weapons stop dead in their tracks when tossed at armor-clad foes. There are quite a few baddies taken from previous titles, but at least half of them are brand spanking new. After completing the game, a more challenging second adventure begins with, haha, you guessed it, a fuck ton of aerial enemies added, and wait, what? Were these Simon's Quest skulls in the original mode? Did I miss them? If you took an ally to help you defeat Dracula, he's also available from the start of New Game Plus, which is quite the little treat, as normally Trevor goes solo for the first couple of stages. Nice. This truly was an epic experience for the time. I always hesitate using that word because it has simply been ruined in recent years. Everything from a can of delicious beer to a dog looking adorable in an Instagram video is epic, apparently. Humans ruin everything. Bosses are the best they've been so far, even if some of them get reused a few too many times. At least a couple of them switch up their patterns with unexpected new moves. This dude took me an embarrassing amount of time to defeat in his second form. All of their patterns are pretty easy to figure out, but they can be a bit of a challenge since, you know, it's nearly impossible to find health anywhere and the run up to them is often very treacherous. Medusa's back, but this time she brought her full body along. It's awesome that her projectile gaze can now freeze the player. Good old Monster Frankie's here, looking better than ever, but he's a bit of a pushover. The bat now splits into tinier forms. Is it just me, or is the Famicom version of this particular battle a little tougher? They seem more aggressive or something. It's so cool how they bellow in agony when defeated. '80s movie freeze frames still exist, but you'll have to strike a pose when your character hits the crystal, no more wiggle room. This big bad bone dragon is a noteworthy inclusion. First, it's fought here in this gorgeous Atlantis-style stage. He ducks out halfway through when the environment begins to flood and the water continues to rise up as we make our way vertically through the second half of the area. A final encounter, finish it off, just so good. There are tons of clever little moments like this peppered throughout the lengthy adventure. Cool effects, beautiful backgrounds. 95% of this game looks truly spectacular, with only a few repetitive boring ones that feel a bit phoned in. They're still better than what a lot of other studios could do at the time though. I really enjoy the nods to the original NES game, such as the entrance to the titular castle complete with Vampire Killer. Yeah, I'm jerking it too, Alucard. I get it, man. It's a beautiful looking game. Different endings. Wait, Scythe is a good boy.
Trevor, that is wrong.
Look, I've said it enough, this is subjective, but hey, I'll be the first to tell you how wrong it is to have this above Dracula's Curse. It's sloppy, confusing, repetitive, poorly laid out, and ultimately, it kind of feels incomplete, but you know, I love it. A lot of this boils down to nostalgia, but there are a lot of things I legitimately enjoy about this sequel. First and foremost, the atmosphere, which is something of a crutch a lot of reviewers rely on. Atmosphere isn't necessarily quantifiable. It's the same as saying fun. Neither are apt descriptors, so how about this? I really like how this game feels. I really like how this game makes me feel. Castlevania is a series I dive deep into every year around Halloween. We live in a part of the world with seasons, and October is my favorite. Long hikes with H.P. Lovecraft audiobooks playing in my ears, windows wide open under a cozy blanket, hearty meals prepared with seasonal root vegetables. It's my thing. To me, there's nothing better than grabbing a portable video game system, chilling outside, and playing some Castlevania while listening to a spooky tale. Candle flames glowing out of a jack-o'-lantern's mouth. You get the idea. Simon's Quest just feels like all of that, and then some. And October hasn't gone by since I was a kid that I didn't make my way through the land of Transylvania collecting sacks of the Count's body parts. Hell, when I was younger I used to write my own Castlevania stories. First with this one, then another after Bloodlines was released. I got a pretty stern talking to when my parents found that tale. Yeah, that's right. I was writing fanfic before it was considered cool, but here's the secret everyone's afraid to tell you. It's still not cool. It was and always will be embarrassing. So is dressing up like fake characters on any day that isn't Halloween. Just saying. I still remember the day I rented this thing for an entire weekend. Hours wasted getting nothing accomplished, but I absolutely loved every single minute. Like Zelda and Xanadu before it, Simon's Quest took me to another world, but my favorite kind of place. A dark, cryptic one where my imagination could run wild. In my Raiders of the Lost Ark for the 2600 review, I called bullshit on anyone who could beat that game back in the day without a guide. Most of the time I'm just kidding and like to throw around hyperbolic statements. I legitimately have no idea how someone could figure out that mess, but if I could complete Simon's Quest without assistance in the late 80s, anything's possible. This is just one of those games for me. When I went away to college, I was constantly under very strict deadlines to produce paintings and portfolios, so outside of having a few 40s of malt liquor in my apartment with a bowl or two of weed or maybe some shrooms with some friends, I couldn't really get out all that much. On breaks, we'd often play one of 3 games: Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Symphony of the Night, or this one. Everything everybody has ever said about it is true. It's vague to the point of being misleading. The day-night cycle gets tiresome very early on. It barely resembles its predecessor, but sequels back then went out of their way to be different, and that's why I love Simon's Quest. I've mentioned it numerous times on this channel, but my favorite trilogies are the ones with a weird, dark middle chapter. That's precisely what this is. There's nothing I enjoy more than to be tossed into a mysterious world with only my wits at my disposal. Castlevania 1 and 3 are challenging experiences that almost primarily rely on skill. This one is noticeably easier straight out of the gate. Exploring the world is the entire game. Enemies inflict a small amount of damage, dying places you in the exact same spot you perished. The penalty for losing all your lives is to pick up where you left off without any currency. Hearts now act as money for items in towns, but also work the same way they do in the other 2 entries. Sub-weapons still exist, but they remain in Simon's inventory. Fortunately, the holy water is the most useful item for the second game in a row, but can be used infinitely as it no longer drains the meter. Daggers return in a few forms, but they're still tied to the old system, where they drain ammo. One major oversight is that it's only possible to collect 256 hearts. This is probably my biggest gripe, as villagers disappear at night, and oftentimes an item is required to push forward. If you've maxed out this heart meter, there's really nothing else to do but find a safe location where there are no ghostly ghouls and maybe shave your legs eggs or grab another beer until in-game morning. Why risk the damage when there's really nothing else to do? I suppose you could just go into a mansion, but if you've completed the ones available and simply need the next item to progress, you're kinda boned. Other than that, I really don't have a problem with the cycle. It's cool how enemies take more hits when it's dark outside, and how it's generally a lot easier to get around in the daytime. Graphically, it's rather basic to look at today, but I have a soft spot for the blocky background color patterns. The areas are a little too similar, which makes navigating the mostly horizontal world needlessly confusing. Forests, lakes, dark caves, and rocky terrain, occasionally a swamp, sometimes a graveyard. There aren't enough discernible landmarks to let the player know where they are. It also lacks a map, which I don't think would be much good anyway, since everything is on a very flat plane. Now you couple this with all of the secrets and you've got a recipe for a perplexing nightmare. When it comes to plotting a course, it's a real problem. Equip this so the boatman takes you to a new area that looks exactly the same as the one you were just at. But now women, but before men? Or was it the other way around? Wait, what? See, this guy is as bewildered as us all, and super impressed with my jumping skills. The mansions aren't very good. These are placed everywhere and contain one of 5 body parts of Dracula, who during the final battle in the first Castlevania placed a curse on him. Such a great setup. The issue is that none of these decrepit buildings have any character. They're all super simple boxes filled with the exact same bricks. What's more is that none of them seem to have been designed with any care. It's as if the insides were randomly generated by a rogue computer. They're underwhelming. Now, I've always chalked the emptiness up to the status of the country. Everyone's recuperating after a horrific vampire invasion. Thinking about it this way with a little bit of imagination makes everything feel more intense. Shopkeepers forced to go into hiding, locking themselves behind walls in their homes, fearing the green ghoulies who reliably appear at night, decaying mansions populated with monsters. Transylvania is a scary place.
Get away from here!
The intense boss battles present in its predecessor, nowhere to be found. Simon's primary goal is to purchase an oak stake in each mansion from these weird wandering ladies and strike an orb for a piece of the Count's dismembered body, and a ring for some reason. It barely resembles the white-knuckle action stages of its brethren, but it doesn't need to, and I'm totally fine with it. This is a different type of adventure, a calming one where you almost have to go out of your way to lose a life. There are 3 big bads, including Dracula, but to call these bosses would, yeah, 2 of them don't even need to be fought. Simply stroll right on by. They don't even stand in your way. They don't even stay dead, even if you conquer them in battle. I don't think I've ever played a game where an enemy was just sort of like, nah, it's all good, just keep going. If you defeat me, I'll just be right back here wandering around. The limited, if any, frames of animation given to these are example enough that this was either an unfinished project or maybe developed in an opium den. It's kind of embarrassing, but also charming in the same way a bad film can be enjoyable.
Morphine? Or cocaine?
So many things could have been fleshed out a lot more. Simon unceremoniously levels up when the player's doing well. The translation is expectedly terrible, only here it's not as laughable as that from Dracula's Curse because you actually kinda need some guidance. Seriously, how did I finish this several times as a kid? The only way I can imagine that I figured out the infamous tornado part was that I accidentally had the red crystal equipped and instinctually ducked due to how familiar I was with doing so in the first Castlevania to collect secret treasures. It's a stretch, but who knows? Everything's a bit poorly designed from the ground up.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Artifacts clip through the other side of the screen, enemies are often right on top of you when transitioning to a new area, and death pits are placed so near that you almost have to know they exist before heading into a new environment. Whoops. Look at this choppy vertical scrolling. Whatever those developers were on.
Morphine? Or cocaine?
The slowdown, just wow, seriously, send me some of whatever you guys were taking. It's all good, man. Nothing's here to kill you, just chill out.
My mind rebels at stagnation.
Simon looks like a badass this time around in his red and black garb. The shading on his face is really cool. As I mentioned, the holy water is the most handiest of items. It does a small amount of damage to enemies, stuns them, and reveals hidden blocks, because there needed to be something in this super calm game to cause a bit of friction. I mean, if it weren't for these and the confusing layout of the overworld, Castlevania 2 could have been retitled Simon's Leisurely Trip to the Corner Store to buy a carton of milk. No? A bit too wordy? Well, how about we just make some of the bricks invisible instead? Toss in a couple of floating pixel corpses. What was it? What would you say in the back there? Animate them? No, there's no time for that. Let's just throw them in there like clip arts and call it a day. One thing no one can argue about is that the soundtrack is fantastic. I'm still gonna poke some holes in it though, because I'm a prick.
You fucking prick.
Freeze frame!
Kenichi Matsubara did a stellar job with this music, but for such a sprawling adventure, the pieces are way too short. They loop so frequently, and there are so few that if you're anything like me, you'll be reaching for your closest Black Flag mixtape just to get some sweet relief. Alright, so I'm exaggerating again. This isn't the 80s, so maybe a record or a podcast. LeVar Burton Reads is a lovely listen. All of the music is superb, but Konami really milked Bloody Tears dry, while other, equally as iconic tracks lie by the wayside. I'd be happy to never hear it again. An incredible piece that has been overplayed more than anything from Zeppelin 4. Thank Christ there isn't a Butt Rock FM channel dedicated to video game music. At least not anymore. Once again, the entire soundtrack needed to be reworked for the NES. A lot of the music on the Famicom disc version has a warmer quality, oftentimes giving it a bell chime feel. If we're talking Bloody Tears, I prefer the Western intro a lot more, but prefer the original's gothic driving harmony in the midsection. The Silence of Daylight is all around better with the beefed up audio channels present on the FDS, probably because there isn't a whole lot of low end in the arrangement. Or, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, because this bass seriously kicks ass. At the end of the day, the music on the Nintendo Entertainment System has a punchier low end. The bass and drums were given a little bit more heft. The snare is also snappier. Check out Monster Dance. That super high-pitched chime sound was evened out significantly when it was reworked for the limited hardware. To me, there's no denying that the mansion theme is much more haunting on the disk system alternative, though. I absolutely love the brief overture here where the percussion takes a breather for a bar or two. On the NES, Konami did that late 80s wah-wah wobble thing that I've always found unappealing during this era on their soundtracks. There are quite a few differences between the versions, but according to IGA, the Japanese text was as cryptic as the Western one, so maybe it wasn't an error in translation. Perhaps the townsfolk were liars all along. One thing that makes the original nearly unplayable for me are the loading screens. Yeesh. Patience is a virtue, I suppose, but this is a bit much. At least there is a save feature. The NES alternative has a fairly lengthy password system. Is it just me, or does the cursor feel a bit sticky? It's constantly getting hung up on letters and numbers. 3 endings. Perhaps the coolest feature in Simon's Quest is that it's timing the player. The most satisfying for my money occurs if the participant rushes their way through, resurrecting and defeating Dracula in less than 8 in-game days. When I was younger, I still remember the first time I saw the second conclusion. I had no idea there were others, so it was definitely a big surprise. Wall meat no longer exists to replenish Simon's health, but most towns have priest-inhabited churches who will completely restore the life bar. It also tops up when the player reaches a new level throughout the world. Secrets are peppered throughout the land of Transylvania, as are item and weapon upgrades. I absolutely adore the explorative freedom whenever I give this adventure a whirl. Compared to modern titles that it helped to inspire, it's relatively linear, but there's still a bit of wiggle room. Specific goodies are necessary to gather, but others can be skipped altogether. Certain mansions can be tackled out of the intended order, and hidden characters exist to lend a helping hand. Silk bag isn't the thing I dropped on the ground to summon you a silk bag. Enemies can get rather repetitive. Skeletons, 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 but the ones introduced are ghastly and well drawn. Blobs can suck it though. Jesus dude, just give me a break. I think we need some space. Blobs! Wait, that's a half heart, but it gives me more hearts than a full heart. I guess the full hearts are a bit smaller. Hearts, Dracula's heart, boatman, please. So you spelled possess correctly here, but couldn't be arsed to get it right a few screens over. Consistency, Konami, consistently. Look, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that this thing doesn't have problems. We live in an angry video game echo chamber where people base their opinions on the experiences of others. It was simply a different time. Studios were experimenting. You can't tell me the Dragon Quest series wasn't confusing for Western audiences the first time around. I mean, hell, it was called Dragon Warrior. Again, I'll reference Zelda 2 and Xanadu. Everything was a bit more cryptic. Translators weren't as integral, and no one knew what the hell they were doing. These Simon's Quest developers dared to be different. Konami's own The Maze of Gallios may have been a sizable inspiration for this wild departure, but Castlevania 2 is still one of a kind. So good, I own it twice. Plenty of ROM hacks and fan remakes exist. Honestly, I've barely touched them, but apparently people dig them. Quality of life improvements and all that. I'm cool with the original and don't see the need. Ballsy how the Big K re-envisioned this series from its gameplay to its narrative. Finishing the quest doesn't necessarily save the hero from Dracula's curse. Now that's heart.
The only place I dare show my face. And such a handsome face, too.
Of course it has to be the original. I mean, there were only 3 games on this list, and I've covered the other 2, so by a process of elimination, it had to be Castlevania. Not only is it my first choice in this trilogy, it's also my favorite in this series, and my number 1 NES pick of all time. Where do I begin? What's to say about this masterpiece that hasn't already been said? When? Why? Who? Dracula, that's who, and he has gathered a group of classic movie monsters. Universal and Hammer Horror were the clear inspiration here, something showcased predominantly in the credits. Pure arcade goodness. No cheesy dialogue or goofy-looking anime characters. Simon Belmondo struts up to the gates, and boom! We're in the game. The opening cinematic is iconic. Back in the mid to late 80s, this was the most impressive screen I had ever seen in a video game. It has been reworked so many times and still looks amazing today. Everything you need to know about the controls is exhibited succinctly in the run-up to the titular castle. Items, hearts, whip upgrades, it's all here. Once inside, the enemies approach on one plane for a few paces before things get a little trickier. Jumps over insta-death chasms are gently introduced, with only a few in this underground Fishman region. Video game design 101. Show, don't, tell. It's the prime example of difficulty scaling. Each level is a bit tougher than the last. It gradually slopes upward. No spikes. Yeah, well, some spikes, but you know what I mean. The second stage tosses more at the player. Tons of bottomless pits and a few more aerial foes. The third introduces trickier staircase combat before a harrowing horizontal gauntlet of tough enemies presented on a high bridge. It truly feels like you're scaling this incredible castle before the plunge. This is where the gloves come off. By this point, the platform should be second nature, ducking, attacking, jumping, precision. What's interesting is that the second to last full level has 0 death pits. We're getting close, and you can feel it. The baddies are more intimidating, but it's all perfectly balanced. Again, the environmental design says it all. Regal, opulent corridors packed with treacherous armored foes. It's so good. Controlling Simon is perfection. He's a leather-clad muscled dude, so of course he's not going to bounce around like a pasta-fueled plumber in cheerful overalls. He's big and bulky, maybe even a bit handsome with that 80s mane. The one thing I've heard numerous times over the years is that Castlevania's biggest flaw is in the movement, how Belmont can't be controlled in mid-air. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but expecting this to feel like a generic platformer is missing the point altogether. It's designed this way to encourage thoughtful movement. Everything is deliberately placed, so it requires patience, memorization, and skill. This may sound dismissive or elitist, but if you're expecting in-air flexibility, you're simply playing the game wrong. Maybe it's not for you. I liken it to the small group of vocal individuals who complain about Souls games not having an easy mode. Not everything is going to be everyone's cup of tea. There's a rhythm to Castlevania. It's one of its defining factors and part of what made it a revolutionary, inspirational game. Sub-weapons are carefully placed with indestructible candelabra. The axe is hefty, does a lot of damage, and can be thrown in a vertical arc. Boomerang Cross is extremely powerful with its long reach, easily the second best sub-weapon in the game, but not nearly as useful here as it is in Dracula's Curse. A stopwatch to make all things stand still for a few ticks. Dagger knife, same general trajectory as the boomerang, but tiny, weak, and placed in the most inconvenient spots to ruin your day. But that's all part of the fair, balanced challenge. The holy water, if you thought it was helpful in Simon's quest, oh boy, are you in for a treat. It stuns enemies, chips away at their health bar, and makes a satisfying sound. Glass smashing wonderful. These candelabra always hold the same gear, so memorizing the important ones is key. Dracula's minions drop random goodies when defeated. This happens so infrequently that it might catch you off guard. If you've already got the projectile you're happy with and it's leveled up to the max, it only takes one sloppy second to have an entire run completely ruined, or at the very least made much tougher. These flea men before Frankenstein's monster have messed up my flow too many times to count, but it's always my fault for being hasty and careless. Continues are unlimited and the stages are short, so you've always got a fighting chance. Throwing yourself at a tricky sequence over and over is a viable option for patient players. It's a short game with meticulously placed traps, so you'll get the hang of the flow sooner than later, and oh boy howdy, when you do, there are very few games like it. Similar to Ninja Gaiden, a title that was clearly aping the Castlevania formula, it requires near perfection, which leads to a euphoric experience. One one that demands multiple playthroughs. I'm not a speedrunner, but both of these NES outings will make you feel like one due to how well you'll end up knowing the levels if you stick with it. Dying at Dracula even lets you respawn for all eternity right outside his chambers. With time and patience, you will succeed.
What the fuck is that?
The Famicom alternative even has an easy mode for those who need the practice, unlike those pesky Soulsian games. You don't even need to type "help me" as your name before a password screen. An extra 6 lives, 25 more hearts, no knockback, less damage taken from enemies with double the amount given, and you even retain all sub-weapons with double or triple shots upon death. Visually, the Japanese disc version has a few tweaks here and there, but they're barely identifiable during gameplay. Multipliers exist for the sub-weapons. These are rewarded by collecting blocks with Roman numerals printed on them. They allow the player to toss a projectile more than once, but reset when a new item has been grabbed. To make these drop quicker, simply use the sub-weapons on candles and enemies more. I think every 10th one coughs up the slab. All of these elements would reappear in Dracula's Curse, but were almost completely absent from the second game in the series. This is such a clever system. My favorite entries in the series include some variation of it. Juggling these perks adds a level of strategy to the experience. It makes Castlevania unique and more engaging than a lot of other action platformers from the era. Sometimes limiting myself to specific weapons is how I decide to tackle the journey, offering up tremendous replay value. Simon can also upgrade his whip twice. The default is a leather toe tickler, but graduates to a longer chain variant. Can we take a brief detour to discuss how perfectly these developers handled stairs? At a time where others attempted to include them in their games, these Konami folk nailed it straight out of the gate. Definitely a revolutionary standout. The third entry tried to get a bit too clever with it. Long stretches of enemy gauntlets cheekily tossed in for the sake of ramping up the challenge, pun intended. Nah, they knew better here, as there's only one tricky spot and it's placed at the very end, where it belongs. This clock tower sequence always feels like Daddy D's last-ditch effort to take out Big B with every annoying enemy in his arsenal. The way it should be. Hidden treasures exist. These add points to the score to give the player a 1-up. Kneeling down on certain blocks normally reveals them. There's even a secret Gradius nod in the second quest. After defeating Dracula, a new game plus of sorts opens up with the aforementioned new trinkets to collect for points and tougher enemies. So basically, more bats and those infamous Medusa heads. A giant handful of people seem to have a real problem with the aerial enemies in general. Personally, I think they're well designed with predictable flight paths. It just takes some practice to master the patterns. All of the bosses are interesting with distinct movements to memorize. Nearly each and every one of them can be exploited by forcing them to freeze in place with smashing bottles, but that just adds a bit more flavor, as doing so requires skill. Well, sometimes. I can't tell you how many runs I've made through this game trying to shave off a few seconds. Feel like tackling the stages with nothing but the whip? Go for it. All leather? Sure. No holy water? Well, it's your funeral, but the world is your oyster. The animations are primitive but charming. I'm a huge fan of the colorful bricks and backgrounds. Many of them have a gothic oil painting look, with some almost entering into the realm of abstract impressionism. Yeah, maybe I'm going a bit too far, but there's something about the simplified textures on display that really appeals to me. It kind of breaks my heart when people call these ancient games ugly. I couldn't disagree more. Sure, they were limited with what they could do in '86, but I prefer using my imagination a bit, and think some of these early NES titles look beautiful. I'll say it again, everything is so deliberate, tight, and conceptually well designed. Wall meat is meticulously placed after almost every grueling section. A rotten roast reward for a job well done. Stages have reliable checkpoints busted up into blocks with each door entered. Being able to see Dracula's throne room in the background is brilliant. The bridge that leads to the clock tower, those iconic final steps. I'm still amazed at how wonderful it all is. This was the first cinematic video game I had ever experienced. With realistic singular environments like these, it could be the first ever, at least on the hardware. The bosses, the gigantic bat, Medusa's oversized serpent skull, twin mummies, Frankenstein's monster complete with that tiny irritating repurposed hunchback acting as Igor. Most would say the Grim Reaper is the toughest big bad in the game, but this pair has ruined so many of my runs. Just stand still, you little bastard. As the first game in the series, the bestiary is relatively modest, but it's a brief adventure, so I wouldn't say the enemies are overused. The action never gets repetitive or unfair because everything is, as I keep stating, very carefully placed. Look people, I just can't say it enough. Castlevania is all about that flow. The rhythm is perfection. Konami really were at their peak on the 8-bit Nintendo hardware. Very few developers have ever been so consistent, inspired, and all-around prolific. The gameplay, the visuals, the music. Would you just listen to this thing? Eat your heart out, bloody tears, or how about 2 tracks, 1 level? Well, I guess it's technically 2 levels since, you know, like the pit, and then ascending from the pit, 2 tracks, 1 stage. Mind blown. Kanuyo Yamashita was the musical lead, with Satoe Terashima adding a helping hand. To say this soundtrack is an iconic masterpiece would be selling it short. These two ladies absolutely nailed it. What's even more impressive is that this was not only Yamashita's first and only Castlevania project, it was also her breakout composing experience in general. Has there ever been a better piece to open a video game than Vampire Killer? I mean, even the title is incredible. Alright, so there are a few others I'd put right up there, all of them belonging to this series, and beginning from Dracula's Curse is one of them. But this was the first. Without this beginning, there would be no beginning. Every tune is a masterpiece, but there's one that gets me going more than the rest each and every time I hear it. Disco pop perfection. Wicked Child is simply the best 8-bit tune out there for my money. That groove. Ports and portables, naturally this thing was thrown onto everything. A few notable versions here: DOS, not to be confused with DOS, that wacky little DS tracing simulator. This is a serviceable computer game. It's rather choppy, but better than a lot of other hastily crafted MS ports from the era. The Amiga one is colorful, but sorta wretched, with its deformed enemy designs and clunky keyboard controls. Up to jump isn't something I'm going to be able to get used to in my lifetime, especially when the game isn't necessarily designed around that control scheme. The music is fine, a bit of a swingin' feel going on. It looks like the developers tried. Decent production value. Typically I gravitate toward the Commodore 64 option if I can't play the real game, you know? But it's as irritating to control as the Amiga version. Hold a key to unleash a sub-weapon, up to jump. I'm not sure why the candles are so high, but sharing a basic mobility function with an item input results in a lot of accidental axes. The music is also pretty bad, which is surprising considering how much I typically enjoy the kit's sound capabilities. I'm most familiar with the Game Boy Advance port. Remember when these things got released for a discount price before the eShop had us all repurchase them again on every single Nintendo device for close to 2 decades? I've lost count how many times I've bought Castlevania and Zelda 2, but this was a handy way to play them on the go, complete with a save function. Konami did a lot of work for the MSX, so quite a few of their popular franchises appeared there, but we'll be covering that one in its own video. Can these screen wipe crucifixes be in worse places? Useless. Invincibility jugs. Hitoshi Akamatsu was the director of this entire trilogy, or was it Trans Fisher, Vram Stoker? What's a Vram, and why would you stoke it? Never ever stoke the Vram.
Remember, only you can prevent forest fires.
Clearly, Castlevania had a huge impact on me. As a fan of Universal Monsters, Hammer Horror, and the macabre, it simply blew my mind at a young age. I've never been completely disappointed by any of the games in this series, but if you were to have told me as a kid that I'd still consider the original the best all these decades later, well, honestly, I probably wouldn't be all that surprised. It's an incredibly fine-tuned experience, still number 1 with a silver bullet. But wait, there aren't any werewolves here. I'm sure most consider Dracula's Curse their favorite, but the pick up and play nature of the original will always have my heart. Once again, the Castlevania collection exists on all devices. Pick it up. Play these classics. Use save states if you don't have the time or patience for these older titles. I didn't use them for this review, but they're definitely helpful for newcomers when it comes to Simon's Quest and Dracula's Curse. If I may be so bold, I'd urge you to learn the first game without them. There's nothing more satisfying than mastering a perfect run through this super short arcade game. Thank me after you've managed to tackle the entire thing in 20 minutes or less. Trust me, it's a wonderful feeling. I guarantee you'll want to attempt no-hit runs or other personal challenges on subsequent playthroughs. It's just an honest, well-refined, arcade-style video game. Next time on this channel, still no werewolves, but lots more Castlevania, so stay tuned!